Hello viewers, in this session we will see the interpretation of the poem A Letter to My Aunt, which is written by Dylan Thomas. We will study thematic concerns and literary approaches to the poem. We will also study the poem as a satire on the modern poetry and poets with special reference to A Letter to My Aunt. A Letter to My Aunt is written by Dylan Thomas. It discusses the correct approach to modern poetry. The poet has given an ironic subtitle, A Letter to My Aunt, discussing the correct approach to modern poetry. In general, the poem can be labeled as Dylan Thomas' critique of his own poetic style. Since it is a poetic satire, it has two targets. One aims at the core meaning of the poem as suggested in the subtitle, and another aims at a critique of his obsession with half rhyme and his short flirtation with surrealism. Dylan Thomas was born on October 27, 1914 in Swansea, Wales. He was a great Welsh poet, short story writer and a playwright. He was well known for his originality and genius for literary creativity. He studied in a grammar school and left it at the age of 16. Then he moved to London, where he started his literary journey and published his first book of poetry comprising 18 poems in 1934. At the early age, he got a good exposure and was recognized for his extraordinary talent of poetic creativity, diction and imagery. Shortly after this, he came into limelight as a literary artist, which encouraged him to contribute more and more. Some of the anthologies of his poetry are 18 poems written in 1934, 25 poems written in 1936, The Map of Love in 1939, New Poems in 1943, Deaths and Entrances in 1946, 26 poems in 1950, In Country Sleep in 1952, and collected poems between 1934 and 1952. In addition to these anthologies of poetry, Thomas wrote plays, short stories and satires, scripts for motion pictures, documentaries and so on. Thematically, Dylan Thomas' poetry seems to be obscure due to the elements of surrealism and personal fantasy. His poetry is introspective and has a personal or biographical touch that reflects the influences of various people and phases in his life. Dylan Thomas was considered to be a legend for his contributions to English literature in the United States of America and all over the world. Such a great genius, poet and original playwright died of an overdose of alcohol on November 9, 1953 in New York, USA. Dylan Thomas began writing poetry when he was a schoolboy. At the age of 16, he published an anthology of 18 poems. In the course of time, his poetic genius made him a master of poetic creativity and its various devices. Immense variety can be seen in his poetry. He deals with a number of aspects of human life and existence which is skillfully transmitted through various themes. Many poems written by Dylan Thomas gave expression to melancholy in human life. He started his journey as a poet from darkness and then moved on to light. To one of the inquiries, Dylan Thomas replied by saying, "My poetry is the record of my individual struggle from darkness to some measures of light." This is the result of his personal struggle in life. His poetry is subjective and proclaims his real-time experiences as the fundamental principle of his poetry. Dylan Thomas deals with fundamental problems in his poetry. It plays a crucial role in almost all his poems. He mainly deals with birth and life, God and devil, love and hate, and so on. His treatment of these aspects is so typical that they are the ones that distinguish him from his contemporaries. In this context, Henry Treece, a critic, says, "Dylan's first 18 poems have a fetal unity and they are preoccupied with sex. Then, in the next volume, he is found to be obscure and unclear. Later on, his poetry reflects his poetic ripeness and he deals with serious aspects of human life. He writes about human life, struggle and death in general." Dylan Thomas' poetry replicates nature and her mystery. It is found that he was quite alive to the mystery of nature. Nature spoke to him with her numerous voices, and he tried to communicate his own sense of nature and her mystery and her sanctity to his readers. He thinks that nature is original in herself, and her imitation is not possible. If at all this is tried, it will be an attempt to go away from something original. Dylan Thomas strongly believes in originality and one's own genius. He thinks that nature is original in herself, and whatever she creates is excellent. He expects the same from the literary artists and insists that they should be original and creative. Dylan Thomas was associated with surrealism, psychoanalysis, and so on. Some of his poems reflect human predicament, sense of isolation, and the exercise of the conscious and subconscious mind. According to some critics, Dylan Thomas has uncanny insight into the processes of the human mind. He penetrates deeper into the human souls than even Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Bergson would have dealt with psychoanalysis from a scientific perspective. Dylan Thomas was a Welshman and not an Englishman. He contributed to the field of English literature, more particularly English poetic tradition. He extensively read many English poets, but never acknowledged any of them as the best poets. It shows his hatred for English poets and British people. His poetry mainly inherits various qualities of the Welsh tradition. His poems are full of Welsh myths, legends, and so on. It shows his nationalistic and patriotic feelings for the region to which he belongs, his mother tongue, and more dominantly everything which is Welsh. Dylan Thomas is famous for his emblematic poetic style. The present poem, A Letter to My Aunt, is basically a critique on his own poetic style and a satire of an aunt's poetic presentation. It is ironic in nature and discusses the correct approach to modern poetry. Sarcastically, Dylan Thomas provides a subtitle, A Letter to My Aunt, discussing the correct approach to modern poetry. It mainly targets the correct approach to modern poetry and his obsession with half-rhyme and short flirtation with surrealism. The poem was first published in 1952 in the Collected Poems of Dylan Thomas 1934 to 1952. In general, it is observed that Dylan Thomas was very particular about his poetic style, which is obscure and difficult to understand. He was a poet who always described something strange, but with a perfectionist approach. He used symbols and images of nature to express various aspects of human life. He gave proper exposure to his memories and feelings about childhood, life, and death. According to him, images are used to create a feeling of love, and this emotion has to be expressed with suitable imagery, symbols, and other literary devices. Apparently, his poetry seems to be obscure and unclear, but the message that he conveys is always clear. Most of his poems convey the message of religious devotion and its need in degenerated human life. Dylan Thomas was a literary genius. He made highly original contribution to the realm of poetry with an expression to some unique, distinctive poetic facets of his personality. None of his contemporaries was competent enough to be compared with his genius and originality. He was incredible and amazing. He was a legend and was hailed as the greatest poet of 20th century. His poetry is basically inward and subjective in nature. Dylan Thomas, one of the famous Welsh poets, has been associated with Welsh literature and culture. He follows the Welsh culture and tradition heretically. His parents, who were so particular of nationalist ideology, brought him to the English atmosphere. His childhood and Welsh nationalism are reflected in his poetry. Similarly, he was also influenced by the Romantic movement, and it can be seen in a number of his best contributions to English literature. The poet's parents were Welsh and naturally used Welsh as their mother tongue, but intentionally they brought up Dylan to speak the English language and in an English atmosphere. They used English for day-to-day communication in order to make Dylan proficient in English. It was a carefully made family decision which immensely contributed in the building of Dylan's personality and his literary genius. In addition, it imposed on him the nationalist ideology of his parents, which had a great influence on his poetry. This influence can be seen in his literary creations. This is clearly visible in the present poem, A Letter to My Aunt, in which Dylan Thomas does not glorify any of the English poets or writers except W.H. Auden and Geoffrey Gregson, who lived in England intermittently. On the contrary, Dylan Thomas makes a mockery of surrealist English poet David Gascoigne. This shows Dylan's anti-English sentiments. On the other hand, he can be compared with Ezra Pound, an American poet, for his writing style, literary genius, and other constructive aspects. Ezra Pound had a perpetual influence on him. Some critics interpret this poem as a satire on romantic poetry. According to them, it places emphasis on everyone and everything which has faults. In fact, there is nothing perfect in the world, but Dylan Thomas has a perfectionist approach towards poetry, and he expects that every poet should be capable of giving full justice to poetry itself, despite whatever purity one would have faith in or can perceive. The narrator begins with an appeal to his aunt by making her realize that she is not a literary giant who can contribute immensely to the field of poetry. Obliquely, Thomas wants to convey that the realm of poetry has become every man's land. Incompetent people also compose poetry, whereas they really do not have the fundamentals of poetic creativity and originality. He tells us about the loss of poetic values in the course of time. He writes, "You're not a literary Hottentot, but just a kind and cultured dame, who knows not Eliot to her shame. Fie on you, aunt, that you should see no genius in David G, no elemental form and sound in TSC and Ezra Pound. In this expression, Dylan Thomas expresses his feelings of the sacrificed beauty for originality of poetry. It is a desperate attempt to distinguish himself from others by painstakingly in-depth thought. Hence, he mentions writers and poets like James Joyce, W.H. Auden, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, etc., who are often labeled as brainy writers. This poem seems to be a very jaded attack on the poets of his time. Dylan Thomas seems to be thinking that poetry has abandoned various poetic devices of meaning and metaphor. They are replaced by petty rhymes and diction. The poetry has given up meaning and metaphor for rhyme. In the following expression, the writer says, "Fie on you, aunt, I'll show you how you elevate your middle brow, and how to scale and see the sights from modernist Parnassian heights." This is a slap on surrealism and one of its followers, David Gascoigne. The target might be George Baker and some other surrealists of the modern time. The surrealists have sought to release the creative potential of the unconscious mind. Dylan Thomas has objected to the poetry of surrealists because their works are comprised of the elements of surprise and unexpected juxtapositions. Moreover, they are attacked because they regard their works as an expression of the philosophical movement. In the following expression, Thomas attacks the surrealists, more particularly the modern painters who claim that they have a philosophy of their own and adhere it with the same sense in their artistic creations. In the modern time, almost everything has become duplicate. Many poets follow foreign poets blindly. Painters copy the renowned painters, and their contribution to literature or painting has no originality at all. Thomas very poignantly expresses his view in this regard in the following parenthesis. All modern painters use their feet for painting on their canvas strips. Their wives are mothers minus hips. The next stanza is comparatively positive and encouraging. The poet expects that the modern poets and painters should be creative enough to introduce something new, and that will be their original contribution to the realm of art. He says, "Perhaps it would be best if you created something very new, a dirty novel done in Erse or written backwards in Welsh verse, or paintings on the backs of vests, or Sanskrit psalms on lepers' chests. But if this proved impossible, perhaps it would be just as well, for you could then write what you please, and modern verse is done with ease." He continues the same line of thought and suggests that modern poets and painters should be simple and coherent as far as their literary creations are concerned. Literary beauty lies in simplicity, and nothing is impossible in this modern world. A constructive contribution can make an individual successful only when he or she attempts to write what pleases him or her. In the next part of the poem, Dylan Thomas suggests that new poets should avoid the obligations of using specific poetic diction and style. He thinks that diction, rhythm, rhyme, and style have made poetry artificial. He tells the poets not to be so specific about these aspects which hamper the originality of a poet. Then he refers to Cummings, James Joyce, and W. H. Auden and their contributions to literature. He writes, "Few understand the works of Cummings, and few James Joyce's mental slummings, and few young Auden's coded chatter, but then it is the few that matter." In the next expression, Thomas seems to be keen about literary output of modern contributors. He tells them to be aware of the tradition that they follow, but they should always wish and try to create something original that can be called a good piece of art. He writes, "Never omit such vital words as belly, genitals, and. For these are things that play a part, and what a part in all good art." In the following expression, Thomas is found to be more aggressive. He writes, "Remember this, each rose is warming, and every lovely woman's germing. Remember this, that love depends on how the Gallic letter bends. Remember too that life is hell, and each heaven has a smell of putrefying angels who make deadly whoopee in the blue." In the expression, he talks about how everything has to be new and beauty is sacrificed for originality. He also expresses his views about free verse and how it is prevalent sometimes even in the rhyming poems which need originality. He wrote this poem in a desperate rhyme, but in a satirical manner. He intentionally wrote poetry with strongly intended beauty. He intended a great amount of sarcasm and satire in the poem. Thomas wishes the best of luck to the erupting fire of the next generation in poetry. Towards the end of the poem, Thomas attacks one of the surrealist English poets, David Gascoigne. Thomas makes a mockery of David Gascoigne, which shows his anti-English sentiment. He attacks him for his writing style, literary genius, and other poetic aspects. A final word before you start the convulsions of your art. Remove your brains, take out your heart, minus these curses. You can be a genius like David G. In the last 4 lines of the poem, Thomas makes the mockery so blatantly that one finds it hard to accept, and inspires fire-born thoughts of the poets of the new generation. Take courage, aunt, and send your stuff to Geoffrey Gregson with my love, and may I yet live to admire how well your poems light the fire. In the concluding lines, Dylan Thomas seems to be crowding ridiculous sentences just for the sake of rhyme. It gives the impression that he is pointing out how the meaning of poetry is being watered down, which in the end makes him think that the poems will not be good fire lighters. Since this poem does not seem to light a fire, unless the fire is how ridiculous poetry is becoming. I hope you have enjoyed the scornful attack of Dylan Thomas on contemporary poets in the poem A Letter to My Aunt. By considering the age of Dylan Thomas, it seems that the present poem has simplicity as a feature. He suggests a path for creating beautiful art with simplicity of expressions. He makes a large fusion of realistic expressions. Probably Dylan Thomas may have realized contemporary poetic trend and continued writing poetry with this feature. Thank you.